Okay, so let me share a few thoughts with you about chapter 6. The Great Commission becomes the Great Omission. Or if I were to have titled this, I would have said the Great Commission really has become the Great No Mission. Now, churches don't like hearing that, and they especially don't like anybody saying that to them. However, that is true. Once again, we find ourselves taking care of ourselves more than doing anything within the community around us, or impacting the community around us, and therefore we have lost sight. The church becomes a place where we take care of ourselves instead of making disciples. I'm not talking about making believers. I'm not talking about decision theology. I'm talking about actually, purposefully, intentionally making disciples, mentoring people, training people, coaching people. He says in that second paragraph or so, right away, he said, but the methods used become the focus rather than the Great Commission itself. As a consequence, the Great Commission becomes the Great No Mission. Turn the page with me. He says at the bottom, before that heading, he says, thriving churches have the Great Commission as the centerpiece of their vision, while dying churches have forgotten the clear command of Christ. Making disciples is what this is all about. It's why we're a church. It's why we're called together. It's why Jesus bought us with his blood. It's why we have ministry. We have got to evaluate everything we do. Does this make disciples? If we come up with the answer no, then we've got to be strong enough to say, then let's not do it anymore. We've got to look at every ministry, every facet of ministry. Does this help us make disciples? Does this help us make disciples? Because if the answer is no, then let's be truthful and let's say it. It was good, it was great while it lasted, but it totally took our focus off of what God had designed us to do. He says on the next page, he says, perhaps it's more accurate to say the church decided not to act upon Christ's command. Please understand, we're not saying that, we purposefully went out and we're going to be disobedient to the Word of God, or we're going to be disobedient to the command of Christ, but we lackadaisically, we simply fall into it because it's busyness. We like busyness. Churches seem to be so busy, and if they're busy, well, we must be doing something. When the truth is, it might not have anything to do with making disciples. He says down at the bottom of that page, he says, and obedience in his power means that we are praying to Jesus so that we can reach others. That requires an other focus. That requires us to look beyond ourselves. That requires us to get uncomfortable. That requires us to go. He says on the next page, perhaps it would be more truthful to say these dying churches had Great Commission disobedience. They chose not to remember what to do. They chose their own comfort over reaching others with the gospel. Boy, I'll tell you what, that is so easy to do. We know about evangelism. We talk about evangelism. We talk about outreach. We talk about all these things, but we don't do it. My very first congregation, or the second congregation I was at, I do remember going to their evangelism committee meeting. And at the evangelism committee meeting, they talked about the ad that they had in the paper and how they could better the ad. And I remember thinking to myself, this is ludicrous. We're talking about an ad in the paper. Why don't we actually go out and tell people about Jesus? That would be much better. It might even work. He says on the next page, he says, they wanted the same results as yesteryear, but they weren't willing to expend the efforts. They weren't willing to invite their unchurched friends and relatives. They weren't willing to expend the funds necessary for a vibrant outreach. They just wanted it to happen without prayer, without sacrifice, without hard work. If the church would continue to do church the way they wanted, and he says in the last paragraph, members of the dying churches really didn't want growth unless that growth met their preferences and allowed them to remain comfortable. I have a little note here on my desk that says, when the preferences of the members outweigh the preference of the gospel, the church is dying. Ask yourself this question in this small group. Are we dying because we've stopped making disciples? We've stopped being a part of evangelism. We expected somebody else to do it. We expected the outreach team to do it or the pastors to do it. But we ourselves are not doing it. Would you spend time doing a hard analysis of what's happening here at Lutheran Church of the Master? And for that, I do thank you.